Today, we are going to cover communism in East Asia, specifically China. Tomorrow, we will look at the Korean War, and both of these topics are covered under Topic 19, Lesson 3, in our online resource. So I advise you to begin reading that section today and tomorrow. Let's recap. We are looking at the post-World War II world, okay? But going back 2,000 years, remember that China was the world's most dominant empire for 2,000 years. Part of it was due to trade along the Silk Road and its rich resources, and part of it was the enduring power of the ruling dynasties. And China also was very influential with some of its innovations, not just in materials, but also in philosophy and ways of thinking. The Chinese had always valued education, that's sort of influenced by Confucian philosophy, and also meritocracy. So a lot came from China. It had a rich history for all of those years. And then remember the second age of imperialism, when European nations had modernized and industrialized and were interested in Asia for its resources. And remember that China at this point had weakened. The power of the dynasty was not what it was, and in addition to that, they hadn't modernized and industrialized the way that Europe had. So it gave European nations leverage over some parts of Asia. So a group of reformers around 1912 called nationalists called for some changes. And Sun Yat-sen ended the Chinese dynastic system successfully and created a democracy called the Republic of China. So that all sounds good, but the problem is there is a very powerful industrialized world out there, and the Republic of China did not modernize quickly. It really led to an era of chaos. So then in the 1920s, nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek took over and ran China as a dictatorship. Meanwhile, communism was growing in China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. So you have these two competing leaders and sets of ideology. Now, Mao's Communist Party gained popularity among poor peasants by offering to redistribute land from wealthy warlords. So you could see the appeal of his promises. Now this slide really talks about some of the differences between the Chinese political opponents, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. You can look at that later. We have covered this unit, so I don't want to recap too much. But suffice it to say that from 1930 to 1949, nationalists and communists fought in a bloody civil war for control of China. And occasionally they came together to fight off external forces. So they did have a truce, for example, during World War II and the Japanese invasion. But then after World War II, all bets were off. And, the conflict between the two had reemerged. So in 1949, the communists won the Civil War, and Mao created the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek's government fled China and set up in Taiwan. So you see that on this map right here, the little island of Taiwan. So basically it's two governments, and both are positing that they are in fact the legitimate governing leaders. So the USA at this point we're shocked because we're also dealing with countries in the Eastern Bloc of Europe falling like dominoes to communism because of kind of an overwhelming Soviet influence after World War II. And then now we see this happening in Asia, so we're very nervous, and we have decided that we are going to recognize the nationalists in Taiwan as the government of China. We kept that policy for decades. So, Mao rapidly decided to reshape China's economy, and the first thing he did was something very similar to what the Soviets did when they took over Russia. He basically called for collectivization. He did give land to the peasants, and then what he did is he moved people from their small villages and individual farms into communes of thousands of people on thousands of acres. So you see a propaganda poster with some changes that Mao is advocating for China. And so just look at it and kind of try to determine what are some of the ideals represented in this poster. And like I said, this presentation will be available in the lesson. So let's look at two programs that Mao is responsible for. But before we get to the two programs, let's just reiterate that one of the things that he did do was grant greater access to education and equality, and also health care. So those are things that he did that were positive, but two other programs were a heavy cost to pay, for sure. So one was called the Great Leap Forward, the other was the Cultural Revolution. So in 1958, the Great Leap Forward is initiated. And basically, it's a program intended to increase farm and industrial production. To make agriculture and industry more profitable, Mao created communes where up to 25,000 people would live on a chunk of land with their own schools, factories, housing, and dining halls. And let's not forget to mention that each of these communes had committees that would ascertain that the communist ideologies and policies would be in place and that people were adhering to these guidelines. So the communists were issued production quotas for its laborers to meet, and this turned out to be difficult, and we'll explore why in a second. Let's look at this other propaganda poster. And what that is promising under the Great Leap Forward is, a bountiful harvest. Certainly you would not think that the Great Leap Forward would bring anything negative to the populace of China. But unfortunately, the Great Leap Forward actually caused mass famine and is responsible in part for about 30 million deaths because it was an unwieldy program. And what happened is that they didn't have the industrial powers at that time to meet quality standards. And so basically things were of low quality and agricultural output had slowed tremendously. And there was a terrible weather situation that ended up basically creating conditions ripe for famine. So up to 30 million Chinese are believed to have starved to death. So this is supposed to be a huge agricultural boon that would feed all of China. And actually 30 million people died. And some estimates go by 20 million. It's hard to know, really, but those numbers are astronomical. So you could imagine if 10% of our population died of famine. what that would do to us in terms of morale, and also questioning our government, perhaps, if some of these issues were due to policy, poor policy and planning. So after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao launched another initiative called the Cultural Revolution, and this is designed to purge people who are not committed to the Communist Revolution. And Mao recruited youth because the young could be a bit more enthusiastic or overzealous and impressionable, also to the ideologies that were promoted at the time. So the teenagers formed groups of Red Guards, and I think they maybe felt a little bit self-important. And they all read Mao's Little Red Book of Communist Sayings. This book was also mandatory to own and carry. So you could imagine, if that happened here, if the government told you that you had to own and carry one book of its ideologies, it would be how that would be embraced here. So the Red Guards at this time had a little bit too much free license to decide who was not truly committed to Maoism or communism, and they would attack and brutally kill people. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, also supported some of the atrocities of the Red Guard. So this really pushed China to the brink of another civil war. And at some point, Mao realized, okay, this isn't working too well. So he dispersed the Red Guards by sending them to work on commune, isolated from their careers, families, and education, and probably more importantly, each other, so that they weren't such a domineering presence anymore, and people wouldn't begin to resent them, and also the government by association. So this really led to a disillusionment among the populace of China. So let's just recap what happened during the Cultural Revolution. The first thing is skilled workers and managers were removed from factories and forced to work on farms or in labor camps. So they're removed from doing what they do best. That's also going to undermine the quality, the work quality, when you start moving people from what they're good at doing, for example. So the other thing that was alarming was that Buddhist temples and then some other churches and mosques were targeted and destroyed. Confucian writings, artwork, religious statues were burned. Many of China's great and ancient pre-revolutionary antiquities that survived thousands of years were destroyed. And struggle sessions were conducted. And this is where you would heap abuse, or the Red Guard would heap abuse and public humiliation upon people accused of capital theft. The accusations could be very arbitrary. And usually it was teachers, monks, and other educated people who were accused, and this is actually an entrenched strategy used among any type of totalitarian regime. You want to reduce the number of, or reduce the power of the educated who might denounce totalitarian tactics. You don't want to promote critical thinking, that's for sure. So, about 1,800 died in Beijing alone in August, September of 1966, and hundreds of thousands died overall, perhaps millions. We don't know because it was not an open society. This is something that was suppressed later. And then schools did not operate during this decade. So I'm going to stop here and pick up in another recording. And we'll pick up with the Cultural Revolution, we'll finalize that, and then move on. And it's a shorter recording.